why when we think of God and what he has done for us, we must also think in terms of his rules and his laws, the bounds that he has set and the boundaries he has made to our existence. Those boundaries exist so that we can be set free from the background of material substances that have no choice, that have no self-consciousness, that are therefore not capable of loving and respecting and choosing in favor of God. Not standing as he meant us to stand, one rung below that level which even the angels must envy. For it is the level at which God himself chose to stand, taking on our form and our limitations, even as he sought to redeem our mistaken error about the nature of our liberty. Yeah? For what sense does it make to stand for the freedom to do that which destroys the work that is needed to set you free? Is that freedom after all? That idea of freedom makes no sense at all. And the founders rejected it. They rejected it emphatically in the Declaration. They rejected it emphatically in the course of that long and arduous struggle with the British. It wasn't a snap of the fingers war, you know. It was a war that claimed lives and property, and it claimed children, and it claimed wives, and it claimed all the goods that they had laid up, many of them successfully, in their adventure in the New World. They did not only risk it, they paid for some an awesome price. And that being the case, how can we pretend to read the words that they wrote and not take account of the serious discipline that they accepted for the sake of those words? The notion that somehow what they fought for was absolute licentious freedom is an insult to God and the founding, and I reject it. But what they did tell us was that they fought for right. They fought for right according to whom? According to God. And as he has communicated it to us in the very nature of our being. Now, there might have been an excuse for people to quibble about what I just said a long time ago about whether that was nature and what it involved. But I don't see how we get there anymore. We understand things now in a way that actually makes sense of the Bible and the words of the Declaration from our human point of view more than ever before. People used to have to read that whole passage about the word and think that referring to some abstraction or some magic syllable God spoke and so forth and so on. But we don't have to think that way anymore, as I point out to people all the time now, because I keep reading these things, that the more we learn, for instance, about the human body, the more it appears to be nothing but a very complicated information processing unit. And it turns out that with the right kind of matter at work in that information processing unit, you end up producing the things of this world. Isn't that interesting? That's literally the Word being the thing through which all things are made. And we're scratching the surface, trying to pretend that suddenly we know everything. No, we don't. We're just getting to the bare little outline of what was already told us in the Scripture. We just weren't able to understand it yet. And now that we come to the point where we can understand it better, we're trying to pretend that somehow or another that word does not indicate the presence and activity of a benevolent, authoritative intelligence that operating for our good has laid before us information built into our very bones, as it were, that disposes us to do what is right, to eat the food and drink the water and be attracted to one another in the way that will perpetuate the human species as he intended it to exist. That's what's going on. Now, it's clear that the purpose of government, according to the Declaration, is to secure us as we implement, deploy the freedom that's involved in our execution or implementation, or exercise as we call it, of right. In all the different areas where we are being instructed by God to do that which is for our good, we are in fact exercising right. Yes? And that's the meaning of rights that actually brings it right home, makes it very clear and practical too, by the way. Not talking about abstractions here. We're talking about the things that we must do in order to do more than survive. For God did not intend us for mere survival. He intended us like the stars and like the mountains and like the glorious universe itself. He intended us to portray his glory. So we are more than expected to survive. We are expected to glow with the power and the love and the benevolent intention of God. Well, Alan, that's all well and good. And right, you may be right. That's in the Declaration. How many times, however, have I heard people tell me, that's in the Declaration, but what's that got to do with the Constitution? The Constitution makes no mention of God. Now, there are two possibilities here. That they're wrong about what's in the Constitution, I'll get to that one. Or that they're right, because in an explicit sense, the Constitution does not talk about God. Makes no mention in the Constitution of the Creator. Some of the lawyers try to pretend, and I explored this during the controversy over Obama's birth certificate and the meaning of the words natural-born citizen. And I often explained to people that I knew that I was not so much struck with the phrase itself, though you can argue about what natural-born means. I was struck by the fact that it refuted one of the positions that is now taken almost universally by legal professionals in the United States, which is that the Constitution of the United States is not a natural law document. They always tell you that. It's not a natural law document. It's got nothing to do with the natural law. No mention of the natural law in the Constitution. Well, if there's no mention of natural law in the Constitution, someone explain to me how you can make sense of the phrase natural-born citizen without it. Since I think the phrase natural-born means born according to nature, born by nature, born in the way that nature prescribes. See? And last time I looked, in nature, things are prescribed and operate by the laws of nature. See? And the laws of nature, as the founders acknowledged, ultimately come from the Creator, God. So in the first instance, it looks like the natural law is mentioned in the Constitution. And it's not only mentioned in the Constitution, it's mentioned in a very, very key spot. Because the founders had read Montesquieu, and they understood that in the literal sense, the power of government is invested completely in every executive action. Okay? There is no distinction between judicial, legislative, and executive power at the moment of acting. Those three faculties must come together in order for you to have a lawful action. Right? And so, if you're talking about the executive, every time the executive moves, there's a presumption that all those three powers have been consolidated into one moment. Action is required, a judgment is made that this is the criminal, and that I know the law that this criminal has violated and therefore must move against that person. The executive is required, therefore, to, in that moment, employ what? What Edmund today reminded us is, in essence, tyrannical power. And the only thing that keeps it from being tyrannical is if none of those things that are brought together in that moment have ultimately been decided by the same power, person, individual, group. And that's what the division of power was about, to keep every executive action from being a tyrannical act. See? Quite fascinating. Well, this is something that I think was clear in the minds of the founders, seems to have been forgotten now, but was remembered in every respect when they were putting the Constitution together. See, so when they put that word nature and said, you can't put somebody in this executive position if they're not natural born, they were invoking a standard of natural law so that the key and most important direct avenue to tyranny could not be held by anyone who was not a citizen by nature of the United States. See? Now, I won't go into all of this because I don't have time. But there's another meaning to the word by nature that needs to be considered. Because when we see somebody who's really good at a sport they've never been taught, my wife, it turned out, we went on a trip to Montana, I think it was, and someone took us to visit a shooting range. My wife had never shot a weapon in her life of any kind. And they had one of these targets way off where you hand somebody the rifle, and if they hit it, you'll hear a bell ring, right? And the fellow hands this rifle to my wife, who has never even held a weapon in her life, shows her how to do it, and the next sound you hear is ping, 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 ping. And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, I guess I've got a natural marksman here. See? So we understand at that point that some people just, it seems to be in their bones to do certain things. They seem to have, the green thumb or the disposition to the instrument. They just know what it's about. See? Well, the interesting thing about the United States, it's one of those things that makes me worry of people like Donald Trump, is that they seem to forget that there is such a thing as an American by nature. See, because our nature as a people is not defined by the common language we speak, though that's important to our practical national existence. No, it's not. It's not defined by the fact that for generations and generations we can count the place of our ancestors and the graves of our ancestors within the boundary of this land that has been our own. No, most of us, you scratch us a couple of generations back and we were counting some other place where the bones of our ancestors rest and so forth and so on. No, that's not what defines us as a people. The nature that defines us as a people is the nature of humanity itself. The nature that was intended by God when first he said, "Let us make man in our image and likeness." The nature that he had in mind when he set down the boundaries and the norms that would define our human capacities and our human limitations so that we could be set free. The nature that does indeed define us as a people, but also makes it possible for us to come together in a room that brings together all the continents and practically all the nations of the earth, so that we can sit together as Americans, knowing that by doing so successfully, we advance the cause of humanity itself. That's the nature that is evoked in our Declaration and in our Constitution, for it is the nature of human beings, as was in the mind of God when first he said, "Let us make man." So it looks like the Constitution is a natural law document, or at least must be understood as that at one critical point. And as often happens with these things, and this is into my final set of points, as often happens, that little phrase, natural-born citizen, they kind of avoid talking about it in the courts. And I think that's one of the main reasons they didn't want to take on the objection to Obama's claim of citizenship, because it would have involved making a natural law argument, and they refuse. They don't want to face the truth. They want to keep that little tidbit of information as far off the radar screen of the American people as they can, because they're in the business of overthrowing our form of government. See? But I've got to tell you, the final set of points I want to make tonight, they don't get away with it, because there is in the Constitution another clear vindication of the understanding that the Constitution involves unalienable rights endowed by God. And it's not, by the way, where you think, oh, you're talking about the First Amendment, Second Amendment, this amendment, that amendment. No. It is in the Bill of Rights, though. But it's not a right contained in the Bill of Rights. It is rather a statement about how the Constitution is to be construed. And it says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Whoa. The first question you ought to ask yourself is it possible to retain something you don't already have? No. So when that language was written, saying that nothing in the Constitution is to be construed, etc., The rights retained were being retained by the people who had obtained those rights before the Constitution existed. That's clear. Otherwise, the word retained would be meaningless.
Croc TV.